Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. Hold on one second. There we go. We are here for Together in the Sandbox Board and Staff Relationships. I'm Emily Hermans, Museum Services Program Specialist for the Texas Historical Commission, and thank you so much for joining us today. We know that this continues to be a challenging time for everyone in museums and cultural institutions, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Your presenters today are Anjali Zucchi and Angela Reed. And before I turn it over to Anjali and Angela this morning, I want to briefly share some information with you about the THC's Museum Services Program. Museum Services provides support, resources, and training to museums in Texas, particularly the almost 1,000 small history museums. We provide free consultations on a wide range of topics, and we're here to support you whether you are working from home or your museum has reopened. We offer regular free webinars like this one on a wide range of museum-related topics. All of our webinars are archived on our webpage and can be viewed at any time. We have dozens of webinars available on demand on subjects like podcasting, collections care, and social justice. Our web address is on your screen, thc.texas.gov/museum-services. Our helpful resources page is full of web-based and downloadable museum resources on a wide range of topics. And on the grants and fundraising page, you'll find a lengthy list of grant opportunities available to museums in Texas. And lastly, the Connect and Learn page has information about upcoming free webinars hosted by other organizations and lists of both national and Texas-based museum groups and professional organizations, which can provide a great support network during these challenging and uncertain times. Finally, please know that Laura Casey and I are always available to help our museum colleagues across the state in any way that we can, and please don't hesitate to contact us for support. A few of our upcoming webinars are listed on your screen. Next week, the education staff from Bayou Bend Collection and Gardens in Houston will discuss developing adaptable education programs for varied museum audiences. And then in October, Margaret Cook from the Bullock Texas State History Museum will discuss creating exhibits in response to current events. Then, as a companion to that presentation, the following week, Melissa Huber from Humanities Texas will talk about developing traveling exhibits. Registration for all three of these webinars is currently open on our webpage. There are also many other webinars offered each week by other organizations. I've listed a few highlights on the screen. A complete list of these offerings is updated daily and found at thc.texas.gov/museum connections. Now, before I introduce our presenters today, I want to ask if you have any questions, please type them into the questions box in your control panel and we'll answer them at the end. Our webinar provider does not have a platform for group chat, so your questions and comments will only be seen by me. Today's slides and handouts are available for download in the handout section of your control box. This webinar is being recorded, just double checking, yes. And both the recording and the resources will be available on our webpage within the next day or so. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Anjali Zucchi may be a familiar face to many of you. We've seen and heard from Anjali many times over the past few months. And she has served as the Chief Development Officer for the Texas Historical Commission and the Executive Director of the Friends of the THC since 2016. She has almost 24 years of fundraising, organizational development, and strategic planning experience in the nonprofit sector. Over the years, Anjali has established a successful track record of working with funders on building partnerships for effective mission support and delivery, and with nonprofits on building I didn't put their pictures up for you. There we go. On building sustainability through effective management. Anjali is an architect by training, and she also holds a certificate in fundraising management. She's also served on multiple national, state, and local boards. Angela Reed is the Community Partnerships Coordinator for the THC's Historic Sites Division. In her career of almost 20 years working in both the nonprofit and public sectors, Angela has also served as a historian for Texas Parks and Wildlife, Program Director and Interim Executive Director for Preservation Austin, and Development Manager for the Historic Paramount Theater. Angela holds a Master's in Humanities and Public History from New York University, a Bachelor's in Sociology from St. Edward's University, and is certified in training, consulting, and facilitation from Marlborough College. And with that, Anjali, I'm going to shift the webinar controls over to you, and so you can take it away.
All right, thank you. Emily, can you confirm that you are seeing the presentation slide? Right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us, and I want to join Emily in welcoming you. And I ask this question, or I say this each time, but I know these are trying times, so I'm hoping that everyone is hanging in there and is not completely worn out. And I find that these presentations and our opportunity to share information with you all is helpful and meaningful for us. And I think I can speak for Angela here as well on that. So with that note, for those of you that are new to these webinars, I want to share a little bit about the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. We are a nonprofit 501c3 partner to the State Historic Preservation Organization, the Texas Historical Commission. And you will learn a little bit more about how we operate in that partnership, because that's part of what we're going to be talking about today in terms of board and staff relationships. So I won't go into that right now. What I am going to talk about today is going to be focused on sort of the general big picture board and staff relationships in traditional nonprofits, but then also within my own organization, which is a traditional 501c3 with a slightly different twist to how we are structured from a staff perspective. And then I'll hand off to Angela, who will talk more about other variations of that, and I know she's going to talk a little bit more about that when she starts. So I'm going to jump right in. And we were talking about playing together in the sandbox. And so I want to start with this fun picture I found on the internet, which is essentially what we all do. But we do have a poll just to get a sense of who our audience is today. Emily, if you can jump into the first one, which is about the type of nonprofit organizations that our audience represents. Emily, can you hear me? Emily?
Apologies, I had a brief disconnection. All right, I'm launching the poll.
Sorry about that.
It was poor timing on my computer's part. All right. There we go. If you all can answer that first question. Tell us what type of nonprofit you represent. Give everyone a moment. We've got 66% of responses at the moment. We'll try and get a few more. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close it because we're approaching 80% response, which is really great. And share the results with you. Okay, so we have 53% from museums, 7% from historic sites, 7% from friends groups, 13 say other type of historic preservation organization, and 20% say other nonprofit. And some of those other nonprofits include humanitarian aid, senior village, some heritage tourism, libraries, schools, arboretum, university.
Perfect, thank you. And then there's a second question about what your role within your organization is. If we can launch that.
Sure. There we go. So for the purposes of the webinar today, you're representing your organization as board member or board chair, executive management or ED, other nonprofit staff. You wear multiple hats, or you're just here as an individual to learn more, which is wonderful too. All right, you guys were quick to respond. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Yeah, we don't have an option for consultants. I'm sorry. Our GoToWebinar only lets us have 5 answers to our polls, so we're limited in what we can put up there. But that's a good point. So let's see. We've got 20% board member, board chair, 27% executive management or ED, 32% third or other staff. We've got 13% who say they wear multiple hats, and then 7% here as an individual to learn more.
Perfect. And I'm hoping that the individual who asked about consultants did include themselves in the individuals, but that's a good point, and we'll be sure to include that the next time we have this question. Thank you for sharing that. So what we're talking about today in terms of board and staff relationships obviously impacts everyone that is here, either whether you're as a board member or board chair or representing staff. So we want to start with talking a little bit about governance models. What is your sandbox type? Where do you play? There are broadly about 3 different types of governance models that nonprofits use. And within each type, obviously, as you can imagine, there are variations. You have the strong board and strong executive model. This is the policy governance model. It was developed by a gentleman named Dr. John Carver. He does consulting for for-profit and nonprofit organizations, and his point about this particular model is that this is where the board sets the direction and expectation for organizations and develops what are called end policies. So what are the end results? What are we trying to accomplish as an organization? And then they delegate to the staff for implementation, and the staff develops what are called means policies. So, how do you implement the outcomes that the board expects? This particular model obviously requires a strong board that provides that very clear direction and develops those end policies. But it also requires a strong executive that has, by themselves or with a team, has the ability to implement whatever processes and programs and procedures need to be implemented to accomplish those ends that the board is looking for. This is a model that larger nonprofits typically use because they do have the capacity to have large staffs to implement the board's vision, if you will. Then you have the model called executive focus. This is where you have a strong executive director. When I say executive, I mean the leadership, staff leadership, management leadership, and you have a more passive board. So the board is involved in sort of, fundraising, some strategic planning, sort of identifying and clarifying the mission for the organization, but really the executive is the entrepreneurial sort of force within the organization, and they kind of lead the process, asking the board to do certain things, including focusing on fundraising. This is, I'm sure many of you might recognize this model as being the one that you are functioning within. And then there's the third one, which is called the balanced partnership. Now, this also requires a strong board and a strong executive, but it is really a partnership of equals. It's an exchange of ideas, and this is where the board is clear about their role and responsibilities, and the staff is clear about theirs, and they kind of come together with trust and with full communication to accomplish what the organization is meant to accomplish. In this particular case, the board governs, provides direction, provides some strategic direction as well, and then in partnership with the executive, works on the implementation. Now, what does that mean in terms of our nonprofit sort of environment today? There are about 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States at this time. And of those, about a little below 1.1 million are what are called public charities, which is organizations, nonprofits, 501c3 organizations that work on mission delivery. And this is from 2016. About a third of those, 1.08 million, are large organizations that have expenses over 500,000. They typically have a staff team, a pretty significant staff team. They have clear board and staff delineation of roles and responsibilities. And then 2/3 of that 1.1, almost 1.1 million number, 2/3 of those are small organizations. And these are organizations with expenses between 50,000 and 500,000. That would be, my guess is that would be most of the organizations that are represented here on this webinar. So again, depending on what the expense budget is, this could be an organization that has small staff, 4 or 5 people, or no staff. It could be organizations that have a budget of 50,000, but they focus all that money on programs. And so it's an all volunteer run organization run by the board. So the board is the one that is engaged in implementing the programs. And it is important to understand that there's no one governance model that is perfect for small organizations. So you will find that within your organization, it's not any one model that defines your organization. There'll be a slight mishmash of possibly all 3 at different times. Again, that is also a factor. Depending on who is in the executive management position and who is on the board, you might see that balance kind of shift within your organization. We have another question, just to get a sense of what your sandbox is like. What kind of organization do you work with or work for or are on the board of? So if you can run that, Emily.
Yes, the poll is up. It should be up on your screen. And you can tell us what your sandbox looks like. I should mention, if you're having trouble responding to the polls, you need to exit out of the full screen mode and kind of minimize the webinar window, and then you should be able to make a selection. I know sometimes that's a problem for people. But I see the results coming in. So tell us what your sandbox looks like in terms of your board and staff.
And while you're waiting, Emily, could you list out the options for those,
yes.
of us that cannot see the poll?
So we have full board and full staff team, full board and 1 staff person or part-time staff, a nonprofit board staffed by public agency staff, an all volunteer board in partnership with public agency staff, or all volunteer board doing it by yourselves.
Which is a lot of us, right?
Yeah. All right, so we have about 75% have responded. I will close the poll and share the results. So we have 32% full board, full staff, 29% full board and 1 staff or part-time staff, 2% say nonprofit board staffed by public agency staff, 21% all volunteer board in partnership with public agency staff, and 16% all volunteer board doing it by yourselves.
I'm sorry, what was the percentage for all volunteer in partnership with the public agency?
21.
I am curious to hear, and for those of you that said you're a nonprofit board with public agency staff, if you could just drop your organization's name, if you don't mind, in the chat box for Emily to share, that would be helpful, because that's something that we are, and I'm glad that there are other organizations out there with a similar model. I'm just excited to see that. So I'd love to know which one it is. Okay, While you do that, I'm going to move on. So as you know, the traditional nonprofit structure, we are all very familiar with. You have the board of directors, you have officers within the board, which forms your executive committee. And then you have, depending on how big your board is, you have various committees. The typical ones are finance, fund development, fundraising, governance and nominations, and programs, because programs is essentially what you do as an organization. For nonprofits that have staff, then you have the executive director or the CEO of the organization. And then if you have staff, typically your staff is split between programs and development, admin, human resources, finance, and marketing and communications. And I know many of you mentioned that you wear multiple hats, so I'm guessing that there are several of you on this webinar today that probably wear many, if not all of those hats, and the hat of the executive director as well. So having talked about this traditional structure, the way most traditional nonprofits work is, as you know, is and we're now talking about the 2/3 that I mentioned, which are considered small nonprofits. The staff size is small, and board members act as volunteers many times, and step up and support the programs of the organizations as volunteers. The board also provides governance and fiscal oversight, of course, provides strategic direction, and then committees work with staff on direction for programs and fundraising and financial management. And then staff, with the executive director's leadership, works on the implementation. Now, there are some dynamics and some challenges in this model, and one of the first ones, which I mentioned, is sometimes board members act as volunteers. Now, if you're an organization that is volunteer heavy, and you have board members acting as volunteers, you're now in a position where, as staff member, you are having to supervise your own board, who essentially is your boss, and so that can create some interesting dynamics that staff have to sort of navigate. Sometimes and many times actually, board members provide expertise, legal, financial, and so there can be a dynamic there where there are questions asked of staff by board members that may not necessarily have the legal expertise, but as your boss, they are required to ask those questions, and so you have to, as staff, navigate that, and as board members too, navigate that as well. Typically, for this size of nonprofits, the executive director or the CEO has limited financial flexibility, and so the board has to approve all major expenses, and that major obviously differs from organization to organization. In my organization, I approve expenses, but cannot write the check. So the board, the final approval has to come from our treasurer, and then we can write the checks, which are signed by our treasurer. So we don't get, there's no ability for staff to be able to spend large sums of money. Sometimes, many times, ideally, we would want our board members to be part of the fundraising team. And that creates friction, as we all know, because there are board members who may not be comfortable going out and asking for money. There's also a flip side to this, where you have board members who may know major donors to your organization or are major donors to your organization. And so you have to balance the relationship of staff and board versus staff and donor, and there are some dynamics there that staff have to navigate. In all honesty, and this goes for board members as well as staff, you don't want to alienate those board members who are major donors to the organization, and so that can sometimes create an uncomfortable environment or a dynamic that we have to figure out how to navigate. So the keys to success: how do you navigate all of this, the various sort of situations, and make sure that those dynamics and those unique situations of staff, of board members as volunteers or donors, don't impact how you as staff or how you as an organization, you as board members, can actually do the work that your organization is meant to do. So obviously you start with governance. You do want to have good best practices, governance best practices adopted and implemented within the organization. And that starts with your bylaws. You need to make sure that your bylaws are current and they're reviewed and they're clear. The bylaws don't have to have all the details. Your bylaws need to be supported with a set of policies and procedures, but the bylaws are clear about the roles and responsibilities of board members, officers, staff, committees, all of that. That should be very clear in your bylaws. You do want to make sure that you have the roles and responsibilities all outlined for board members as well as for staff. Obviously, when you hire staff, you do have job descriptions, and that is more typical. What is not typical is having a clear set of a clear job description, if you will, for your board members, starting from board chair to committee chairs, committee job descriptions. All of that, if it is laid out in a clear manner, it helps the board as the governing body make sure that its members are doing what they're supposed to do without any one person becoming the bad guy for implementing those responsibilities. And it also helps staff and board, as you're looking for new board members, to make sure that people that you're reaching out to, people that you are trying to cultivate as future board members, know what they're getting into and know what the expectations are from them. So these job descriptions or roles and responsibilities should outline the expectations for each of those entities that you're creating those job descriptions for. So you want to make sure that your board descriptions have the primary responsibilities and the expectations listed in the job description, and so do the staff job descriptions. You want to make sure, as I mentioned, that you have policies and procedures in place, conflict of interest, volunteer management, donor management, financial management policies. You need to have all those policies and procedures in place so that, again, implementation is done according to those policies and procedures, not according to what any one person, either on the board or the staff, has to say. In all of this, who has the last word? Within nonprofits, obviously, the board is the governing body, and so the board, the majority of the board, will have the last word on issues that arise, conflicts that arise. The board will have the last word, but it's always important for staff to give input in that discussion. So just to talk about the partnership of between board and staff, the board leadership obviously focuses on governance. So you're talking about mission and vision, selecting staff leadership, planning, oversight of finance and programs, services, lead the fundraising. That's a key one, and that is one which causes the most angst, I guess, with between board and staff. But we want the board to guide legal and ethical have legal and ethical integrity, and they're the ambassadors in the community for the organization. The board also leads board development, so training and building sustainability. And then within the boardroom, there's mission-focused governance, and the focus is on stakeholders and on outcomes. On the flip side, the CEO or the staff leadership, their focus has to be on management. So you do commit to mission and vision, you lead the staff, manage the organization, the programs, manage resource development. That does not mean that staff is the one doing all the fundraising. The staff can do that, and you'll see as we talk about what they do together, that fundraising especially is something that needs to be done in partnership between board and staff. Staff obviously implements the strategic vision and effective programs. Make sure there's accountability at all levels, there's compliance to laws, which is very important for nonprofits. And then staff supports the board and makes sure that there's succession planning happening in the board as well as on staff. And then staff are advocates for the organization and the mission. In terms of board development, staff will support the board on the training and building sustainability. And within the workplace, staff's role, or the executive's role, is to make sure that the organization and the work is mission focused and is also focused on process and outcomes. And together, the board and staff, board and executive leadership, share certain actions. There's mutual respect and trust. There's shared purpose. There are responsibilities. There's the social and fiscal stewardship of the organization, and there's resource development, fundraising, succession planning on both sides, as I mentioned. And then you focus on shared outcomes, mission impact, organizational growth and stability, the health of the organization, and adapting to change as it happens. To go into a little more detail, there are roles and responsibilities at different levels for board chairs and boards, and then the staff leadership. Policy and planning, the board sets the guiding principles, staff implements them. Board has oversight of programs, staff has the implementation responsibility, and together they're working on both of those in tandem. For budget and finance, the board has responsibility for making sure that all assets are protected. The board reviews and approves annual budget, oversees the annual audit. The staff, on the other hand, prepares the budget and implements the audit process, supports that, and then applies financial resources to programs and projects appropriately and responsibly. And of course, together they're providing fiscal stewardship for the organization. Development and fundraising. Boards participate in the resource development as donors, as well as cultivators and solicitors. They approve the fundraising plan. Staff obviously develops the fundraising plan and provides all the support that fundraising needs. Staff also does fundraising. It's not just board, and that's the partnership. It has to happen together. Boards and committees. This is pretty clear. Board establishes committees and provides oversight on those specific responsibilities. The board oversees the hiring of the CEO, the hiring, the compensation of the CEO. Staff, on the other hand, provides all the support materials needed for the committees and the board. And the executive director oversees and evaluates the rest of the staff. What is important here is to understand that the board has only one employee, and that is the executive director. It is very important to make sure that the board limits its sort of oversight, employee oversight, its human resource role, only to managing the executive director, and allow the executive director to manage the rest of their team as needed and effectively. This is another area where the dynamics can get uncomfortable if the board decides that they want to oversee all of the staff, and that just does not work. And then there's communications, obviously, between board and staff. That has to be clear. It has to be constant, both ways. Setting up meetings, regular meetings, providing input for agendas. Each entity, the board and the board chair and the executive from the organization, has their own roles to play within each of these. As you can see, they're distinct, but there's some areas where they have to work together. So essentially what we're talking about is, in order to have a successful relationship between board and staff, you have to have a clear partnership. You have to have teamwork. It cannot work. Board and staff have to be constantly working together. So being able to work together is important as well. There needs to be trust, engagement constantly between board and staff, board engaged in the work of the organization as their role allows or as their role requires them to, which means providing the oversight and then providing support to staff as needed. Communication is important, obviously, constant communication between board and executive and the rest of the staff. And providing support for resource development, helping build those strong, solid relationships for lasting success. We have one more poll, and then I have one additional slide to go through before I hand off to Angela. So if we can quickly run through this, Emily.
Absolutely. Let's pull that up here. All right. So this last question is about what does your sandbox look like? Do you have a strong board and strong staff and passive board, balanced partnership, or if it's something else, tell us more in the questions box. All right, okay, I want a couple more seconds. Anjali, we did get some responses to our previous question about what kinds of organizations those folks were from, you know, with and several of them were from the THC's Historic Sites Friends groups, but there were some others as well, and I can pass those along to you. There's some interesting answers. All
That's
right.
I know Angela's going to talk about that, so thank you for sharing that.
So we have, lots of responses. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results. Okay, so we have 15% say strong board and strong staff. 47% say strong staff, passive board. 20% say it's a balanced partnership, and then 17% said other. And in that other category, we got some people who said they're really not sure. And that we had someone who said their board is too strong. The board is being reconstituted. They have a blank slate right now. And then comments about boards that are very strong-willed and opinionated, but not particularly strong in offering support and governance. So, and misunderstandings of roles on both sides. Yeah. That's another interesting comment.
And this is with all due respect to board members on this webinar, because you know, all of us serve on both sides of that equation, and as a board member myself, I know that that's you're there with the right intentions, and you want to do the best for the organization, but it's a dynamic that is constantly sort of, you know, moving, and it's hard to get to that perfect place. So I'm just excited to see that there's 20% of the responses said they have a balanced partnership, which is really where you want to be. So thank you for sharing that. And just to respond to some of the comments, I think I just want to underscore that there is no rocket science in this whole process, but what is really important is having a clear delineation of roles and responsibilities, and all of those roles and responsibilities laid out. That, for those of you that are reconstituting your boards, starting with that will really go a long way in getting you to that place of balanced partnership. If you start with clear expectations, you will get there. So my one last slide, I wanted to just talk a little bit about my organization and how we are structured. I mentioned before that we are a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We have a board, but we are also a partner to the state agency, and we actually implement that partnership through a memorandum of agreement. And there are a few things within that memorandum of agreement that make us slightly different from other nonprofits. The first thing is that we operate solely for as a support organization, as a partner organization to the Texas Historical Commission. So all our fundraising that happens for THC programs and projects. So we don't have a whole lot of our own programs and projects. We do have a few, but not a whole lot that we raise money for. All the fundraising that we do is done for historic sites, state historic sites, programs that THC runs, and all of that. So that's slightly different. We walk a fine line. So as an organization, well, let me step back. The memorandum of agreement also allows THC to have a development office. You heard Emily mention that I'm the Chief Development Officer for the Texas Historical Commission. So we are really the staff. We are staff of the Texas Historical Commission. But through a legislative, rule, THC can use its development office to staff the nonprofit. So I also wear the hat of the executive director of the nonprofit. The positive of that is that the nonprofit does not have to pay my salary and benefits. The state does, but the nonprofit gets the benefit of having a full staff. So that's a fine line. But the fine line that I walk then is that I report to the board as one boss, and to the agency, to the executive director as my other boss. And so that is a dynamic that we have to kind of manage at all times. Our fundraising priorities are set by the Texas Historical Commission, as I mentioned. And so it becomes a little challenging sometimes for us to be able to talk about the projects and programs that we raise money for, because they are not we don't own those programs and projects. But as a partner to the state agency, that's what we raise money for. We do have policies and procedures in place. Our board structure is that the commission, the Texas Historical Commission, appoints one more than half of our board members. That's only for the appointment. They don't tell those board members how they should operate within our board. And so once those board members are appointed, they're like any other board member, and their roles and responsibilities are like any other board member. So they have to do what other board members, which we call our corporate appointees, have to do for the organization. So who has the last word in this situation? And that's always a question. I have my commission guidance from my boss that I have to follow. For governance, the board has the last word. So when it comes to financial management, when it comes to all other governance responsibilities, the board has the last word. The memorandum of agreement also basically requires the commission to give us a list of fundraising priorities that they would like us to focus on in a given year, but our board has to approve that list. Our board has to say, yes, we have the capacity as a board, as an organization, to go out and raise money for these things. So again, this is it's a partnership between not just the board and staff, but the board and staff and the organization, the public agency, which has to be managed on a balance. And I'm sure that there are some of you that have similar structures that also manage that. And again, in all of this, having clear roles and responsibilities, policies and procedures go a long way in making sure that there is no conflict and that we are doing what we need to be doing, which is supporting preservation in Texas. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Angela. Angela, I am handing off to you now.
Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen. If you can, I'm sure Emily will let me know. Okay, good, great. I will try to get through some of these slides really quickly. So what I do for my organization is I work with friends groups organizations, and what that means are these are organizations that support other the historic sites throughout Texas, specifically for me, but I'm sure a lot of you are in the same boat where you support your board, an independent nonprofit that supports an organization that is independent from you. So there are some differences there, even from what Anjali's model was talking about. She is actually an organization that's staffed by the agency, but also supports a nonprofit board, and so the board has staff by the public agency. But if you're a friends group organization, then you're an independent nonprofit that partners with another organization that they're not actually staffing your nonprofit. So that's an important distinction. Now, so let me go through. I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding those roles and the keys to a successful partnership for those types of organizations. And even if you're an independent nonprofit, a traditional nonprofit, I think you'll find some points here that will apply to you as well. So let's start with understanding what a friends group or a supporting nonprofit. I'm going to call it a supporting nonprofit because they're not always called friends groups. Sometimes they're called a foundation or a conservancy. But if they're partnering with another organization, often a public agency-owned organization or a privately owned organization, then the model is going to be a friends group, like a friends group. So a supporting nonprofit. So a supporting nonprofit exists to provide assistance to another organization in the form of fundraising, volunteer advocacy, and promotional support. Excuse me. And what's unique about a friends group organization versus a traditional nonprofit is that the friends group mission statement is almost without exception essentially the same as their partner organization. So that supporting nonprofit may have its independent 501c3 status, but their mission is the same, and they use the name of the organization that they're partnered with. So, for example, if we have a Caddo Mound State Historic Site, which we do, they have a friends group called the Friends of Caddo Mounds. We have Casa Navarro State Historic Site. Their friends group are the Friends of Casa Navarro. And their mission statement, the friends group, or that supporting nonprofit, is to support that site and the activities of that site. So that is a big difference with a supporting nonprofit, and it's an important distinction. And I'm sure y'all know some other examples like friends groups for national, state, or municipal parks, Friends of the LBJ Library, for example, public gardens, animal welfare, historic sites and buildings. So so just so y'all know, that is what a supporting nonprofit does. It supports another organization. And why do they have friends groups? Because friends groups can do what their partner organizations as public or private entities cannot, because those partner organizations do not have a 501c3, but the friends group does. So that means that the friends group can fundraise and solicit monetary donations. They can advocate to elected officials, whereas especially if it's a public organization, like public entity that they're supporting, that public entity cannot advocate to elected officials the same way a nonprofit can. And they also can't directly fundraise the same way a nonprofit can. Also, I want to add that most of those sites that are publicly owned have very specific restrictions on how they can spend the money that has been allocated to them for that year, how and when and how fast. So a friends group organization being a 501c3, an independent 501c3, can have a lot more flexibility in supporting that organization's programs and the way they spend their funds and the things they spend their funds on. So that can be extremely helpful for the organization that they support. They can also promote and organize volunteers and grassroots support for that site, for that organization, oftentimes in ways that site staff cannot, because site staff may have only lived there for a couple of years, whereas oftentimes the nonprofit supporting group is, they have deep roots in the community. They're still working in the community, or they have kids in that community. So they have connections to the community that site staff may not. So they're really wonderful advocates and champions for that organization, and have a lot of passion for that organization that site staff may not be able to convey the same way. So those are reasons why a lot of our organizations have friends groups. So what supporting nonprofits do and what they do not, they are a 501c3, as we mentioned, or sometimes they're fiscally sponsored by a closely related nonprofit, which means that they follow all the IRS and Secretary of State laws and guidelines like any other nonprofit. They are a nonprofit. The supporting nonprofits board is responsible for its own governance. This is a very important point. They are responsible for their budget, for preparing their budget, They're responsible for their membership roles, for their donors. Now, they may get some support from the staff that they partner with, from the organization that they partner with, but that doesn't mean that that staff is accountable to them, nor is the staff able, if it's a public agency, the staff is not supposed to spend more than half of its time working for that nonprofit, because the staff at that public agency especially, they have to use their publicly derived funds for that organization and running the operations of that organization. So they can't spend the majority of their time supporting the nonprofit. But they can do some support, you know. I'm not saying that they don't support at all. I know that they do, and I know that it's needed. So so there has to be a balance there. Just keep that in mind. From the board's perspective, it's important to understand, I think, that the staff is responsible for the organization's operations and programs. They have to adhere to their industry standards, and they have to adhere to what their supervisor, you know, they have their own chain of command that they have to answer to. They're not accountable to the board the same way a traditional nonprofit may have an executive director that's accountable to their board. And that's an important distinction, because sometimes Friends Group board members come into their Friends Group organization thinking that the model is going to be the same as in another traditional nonprofit that they worked with, when the truth is the staff that they're working with doesn't directly support the board in the same way that a traditional nonprofit organization does. So given those tricky situations that you can imagine might happen when the expectations are not clear, I think it's important in a nonprofit partnership with a standalone organization, or an organization that's publicly owned, is that the two get together and really acknowledge that there will be inherent differences and also some similarities between the volunteer boards and the paid staff. Remember that volunteer boards are volunteers. They may have different motivations for being there and things that excite them. So if they're giving their time and their commitment, we as staff members of that public agency want to make sure that they're excited about what they do every day, because they're not there to be paid, right? And then staff members get they get a paycheck to be there. They're also very excited about the mission that they work for, but they're going to have, you know, certain hours that they adhere to. They have their own supervisor. They have different motivations for being there. So it's important to get that on the table, I believe. And make sure your expectations of each other are very clear, and revisit those expectations from time to time. Write down those expectations and find out why each of you are here. Find out what excites the board, what motivates them for giving their time, talent, and treasure, and what motivates the staff for taking that job. They probably spent a lot of time in their lives studying a particular type of history, say, or you know, maybe a specific type of park, and that's why they have that job. It's very important to them, perhaps for a different reason than for the board, because the board, of course, they may have very personal reasons for being there. So talk to each other and find out what's important, and then find ways for each to inspirationally and meaningfully serve in each of your capacities. Revisit your mission statement. You're here in the room for the same reason. You both love this mission statement. You both love this mission. It's mission-driven work in most cases. I'm sure most of you here are here for a mission-driven reason. So if you as a partner organization, and your mission is to support the organization, this other organization, if you are a supporting nonprofit, make sure that you're truly supporting them. And if some of the things that you're supporting, or some of the things that your board is working on, are not really supporting that organization, then maybe think twice about it and have a conversation with the staff that you work with to make sure that you're truly in a supportive role and you're not kind of going your own way. And then again, from the staff perspective toward the board, try to make room for the fact that your board members are there because they're very excited about what they do. They're very excited about this mission, and give them room to support the mission and not say just asking for money, right? Or or putting them more of in an administrative role, because they're going to be uninspired and disengaged, and probably you'll start losing board members if that starts to happen. Actively share your goals, your hopes, and dreams for the organization. That's the board member with the site staff. We do have a poll. I hope, Emily, do we have a little time for the poll?
Absolutely, we can do our poll. Okay.
Okay.
Let me pop that up real quick here. And okay. So what are some pitfalls you've seen when communications break down between supporting nonprofit and partner organizations? And I'll just say, feel free to not respond to a poll if you feel like it doesn't apply to you. You can skip it. But your options are: the nonprofit started a project the partner organization didn't fulfill. And you can select all that apply here. Partner organization planned a program that the nonprofit didn't support. The nonprofit was uninspired and underutilized and treated like an ATM. Or the partner organization was overwhelmed with board requested tasks, or all of the above. Responses are coming in. Give everyone a moment here. Looks like all of these are fairly common. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close it so we can stay on time, and I'll share the results here. But there's a pretty even split here. It's in the 20 to 26% range for every one of these responses. So clearly, all of these things have happened within your organizations.
Yes. So those are really common pitfalls for not just for friends group organizations, but traditional nonprofits with their executive staff across the board. Like I said, I think a lot of the principles we're talking about here can be applied to all types of nonprofits. But this is what happens when communication breaks down, and it's going to break down sometimes. You know, we're talking about an ideal world, you know, Anjali and I, when we're talking about the best types of communication. It doesn't always happen, but how can you bake it in? All right. So how can we bake in those key ingredients to communication practices? And one of them is, this falls through the cracks a lot. You'd be surprised. Having an orientation with the board member and the staff that you work with. What are the industry standards of the organization that you partner with? You may not know. Maybe board members don't really know what the Secretary of Interior standards are. Maybe they've never heard of that. But if you're a historic site, that's what the staff has to abide by. What are some of the standards that their supervisors set for them? What are some of their policies? And on the flip side of that, for the staff, what are some of the board policies that they have? What are their roles that they have on their board? What types of committee structure do they have? What are their goals? Maybe they've done a 5-year or 3-year strategic plan, and there's a new staff member on board and they don't know what those goals are. It's really important to communicate, have an orientation anytime there are new members, and sometimes just have an orientation every year just to reorient everybody with the rules that you're abiding by, or your hopes and dreams that you've set down on paper. Do you have a staff member that you're partnered with as an ex officio member of your board? Because you probably should, at the very least, have a standing invitation and make sure that they are truly invited to your board member meetings, so that there's good communication there. Invite a staff member to give a presentation about the programs that they have coming up down the pike that maybe Friends Group members can get really excited about. Do you have regular meetings outside of your board meetings? Anytime that I've worked with a board, or with staff and me being on the board, it's important to give a call to that executive staff member or to the staff of the organization that you're supporting, maybe once a month, and just say, hey, I just want to check in and see how things are going. Is there anything I should know, or anything you want to tell me about what's going on with the organization or with the board, vice versa. Even if there's not much to say or you don't have a report, go ahead and make that phone call and just see if something comes up, and have regular meetings together. Do you have strategic plans together? These days, people aren't doing so much 5-year plans or even 3-year plans these days. Some of them are doing 6-month plans and then revisiting that because of the crazy times that we're living in. But do that together. It's not just a board activity. It's not just a staff activity. These are things that staff from that organization should be participating in with board members. And it should not be led by either the staff or the board. You really should bring in a facilitator who doesn't work with you from day to day. And then this is, I think, a memorandum of agreement or of understanding or some type of agreed on policies is super important. We operate with an MOA. And in that MOA, we put in things like, we're going to have an annual plan that ideally the staff of that partner organization and the supporting nonprofit work on together. And here's when it's going to be due, and here's who it goes to, who all sees it, who all has to approve it. We have an annual report. We have ex officio board member status for that organization staff. We put all of those expectations and good communication tools in our memorandum of agreement. Anyone on this webinar today, you're welcome to email me or Anjali. I know they work with an MOA as well for their organization, and we're happy to share. We're a public organization. We can share our MOA with you, and there are a lot of examples online as well. And I'm going to skip through this poll. It basically reiterates what we say, but what I'd like to, my message would be to staff, if you work with a supporting nonprofit, treat them like your donors, because they are. Bring them along on your projects. Bring them along when if you're talking with the city about getting hot tax funds, for example, bring a board member, because they're going to be really passionate about your organization. Get them excited and allow them to have ways to engage with your organization. And if you're a board member, treat that staff like one of your team members, because they are. So bring them in and let them excite your board about what they have going on at their organization. So with that, because I think we're right at 11 o'clock, and I want to hear questions if we have time. I wish you good luck, and I'm going to stop. I'm going to try to find a way to share my screen. But here's our email addresses if you all need it.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Anjali. We do have questions. So let me get sorted, because there's a lot of them. So if you all have questions, please type them in, and we will get through as many as we can here. Can you just talk very briefly about what friends groups can support in addition to public agencies? Can they support another nonprofit? Can they support a for-profit? What are the rules about what other organizations friends groups can support?
Angela,
So,
you want?
Yeah. A friends group can support, a privately owned house, perhaps, or a publicly owned, an organization that's owned by a public agency or a municipal park. If it's city owned, then they may want to have a friends group to support those types of organizations that does not have a 501c3. So if it's an organization that does not have a 501c3, then the friends group can form a supporting nonprofit to do that. Anjali, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just one thing, that as you do that, specifically if you're supporting a privately owned historic house, for example, or a privately owned enterprise that is providing a public service, you want to make sure that as a friends organization, your funding is going towards supporting the public service, because that's, as your IRS rules require you to apply your funds, the money that you raise towards public service programs. So whether it's a historic home or it's other programs, make sure that the money is being applied appropriately.
And the friends group themselves needs to have their own 501c3. You can't
Correct.
have a nonprofit that has a 501c3 and then the friends group kind of fall under that same umbrella.
Well,
So
Yeah, you can. So public agencies essentially also operate as nonprofit. Well, they're not 501c3s, but they can raise money. You can make a contribution to a public agency, and then we have, like our organization is a friends organization, nonprofit partner to the public agency. So there are situations where that is possible. I'll let Angela get into that as well.
Yeah, for example, we have a fiscal sponsorship program, and Anjali and I we partnered up on this, and their board partnered up with me because I work technically for the agency, and Anjali, works with her board, her nonprofit board. So we partnered so that our friends groups could be fiscally sponsored and under the 501c3 umbrella of the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. So Friends of Mission Dolores, for example, is a fiscally sponsored group of the Friends of the THC. So if you have a closely related nonprofit, and it does need to be closely related, then you would have a separate agreement with them that's just about fiscal responsibility and 501c3 responsibilities. But you would also have an agreement with the organization that you're supporting.
Great. You talked about having a staff representative as an ex officio member of the Friends group. Should that be the executive director or the head of the organization? Should that be someone from development? Should that be a front lines person? Who should that be that serves in that role?
Our MOA, we specify that it is the site manager. So that would be the executive staff of that particular organization. But sometimes the site manager appoints someone, a program manager, because that's the person who's working most closely with the Friends group. So I think it just depends on your organization and who the Friends group works more consistently with. But it should be someone in a leadership role. If the person isn't in a leadership role, then you would want to know that they're in close communication. So perhaps you could put that in your MOA as well.
Thank you. Can you talk about strategies for fully engaging the board in collaborating and really owning a strategic plan when it's often the staff that's more knowledgeable about if it's a museum, the museum field and museum best practices and their own programs and audiences? How do you really get the board involved in those processes?
Go ahead, Angela, then I'll jump in.
Yeah, it sounds like we're talking about Friends groups, so that's why well, we require that when there's a strategic planning session that both are engaged, and that you have, like I mentioned before, you want to have a facilitator who's not in your daily operations, that they are able to engage both the site staff and the Friends board. And this is hard, but again, I think it's important for those two to be active participants together in a strategic planning session, if that's what we're talking about. But before you even get there, I hope that there's been some type of orientation with each other to talk about what the board gets excited about, and that there's frequent interaction between the staff of the organization and the board, so that they're getting excited about each other's projects, and that the board is actually developing any of their programs and projects that truly support the organization's programs. Do you want to add anything, Anjali?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, going back to what I was talking about what board members bring to the organization and what staff leadership brings to the organization. I think even going into a strategic planning process, if you understand that the board's role is to really provide sort of the big picture guidance, vision, where is the organization headed? Where do we want to be in the next 2, 3, 4 years? The board can sort of participate in the strategic planning process from that perspective. And then the staff, because the staff have the technical know-how, they have the experience, they have the skills, specifically focused on programs, can then say, okay, board, if this is your vision, here are our ideas and our suggestions for programs and projects that would actually accomplish that vision. And so it truly is a partnership, as Angela just mentioned. Even the strategic planning process can be and should be that partnership where each entity is coming with the perspective that they have based on their roles and responsibilities. So the board can say, well, we want financial stability, we want an endowment that is X, X amount within 5 years, or whatever that might be. The board has to provide that direction, the vision direction, the sort of the big picture ideas. And then the staff has to say, well, if you need an endowment in 5 years, here's what we need to be doing. Here are the specific tasks that we need. And here's where we need the board's help. And so that becomes a really collaborative process. But again, you have to come there with a clear understanding of each entity's roles and responsibilities.
And I want to add to that in a friends group situation, it may be flipped a little bit, because the organization they probably have a 5-year plan already that their organization has that they've already worked on, and it's the friends organization or the supporting nonprofit that you hope will come on board with that vision. Now, the friends group organization may have a vision for their organization and the ways that they support that organization, but it's a little bit different. It's always focused towards supporting that entity that their mission statement says that they support.
Thank you both. Well, I know we have more questions. Unfortunately, our webinar provider kind of shuts itself down if we go for too long, so we're going to wrap it up. But please feel free to reach out directly to Angela or to Anjali. If you have more questions, you can send them to me, and I'll be happy to pass them along. I will also send them the questions that came in that we did not have a chance to get to here. So I just really want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Thank you so much to Angela and to Anjali. The recording of today's presentation and the slides and resources will be available on our webpage by the end of the day. And you'll be asked to complete a brief survey when the webinar concludes. And we really appreciate you taking the time to do so, because it helps us plan future webinars. So thank you again to Anjali, to Angela, and to everyone who attended today. And that will conclude our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, thanks.